Do you believe in fairies? In early 1900s England, that was actually kind of a complicated question. The UK and Ireland, as well as Europe at large, have a very long and intense history of fairy folklore and myths that to many people for many generations were serious business. Fairies weren't always characterized as sweet, flower-laden, dancing friends in your garden. In many places, still today, they aren't. Rather than being Barbie Fairytopia types, they were closer in kin to malicious trickster spirits who would take advantage of your foolishness if you allowed them. The idea of what a fairy is would change drastically as the Industrial Revolution rendered their very existence up to question altogether. The world was entering a new era, and the superstitions of old seemed to be long in the past, drifting further and further away as brutal war after war shook society and destroyed people's lives and spirits, but not for everyone. Because at the same time, the spiritualist movement was gaining a lot of steam. So when two images featuring girls with what appeared to be fairies appeared in the Strand magazine's Christmas 1920 issue, claimed to be real by none other than the creator of Sherlock Holmes himself, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, it set off a visceral reaction in the public that would make the "Are Fairies Real?" debate the #1 topic of discourse and cement the Cottingley Fairy photos as one of the greatest photography hoaxes of all time. How were so many people fooled by these photos taken by two children? And were these girls, Frances Griffiths and Elsie Wright, even trying to fool anyone in the first place? Come learn with me. But first, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, Blueland. For the last several years, I've tried to make a few sustainable lifestyle changes like using reusable eating containers and bottles, always making sure I've got grocery bags on me, and trying to buy local products, which is when I realized how hard it is to find cleaning products that aren't filled with harmful or even hazardous ingredients. Luckily, I came across Blueland, which believes that your everyday products can be effective, convenient, and affordable, on top of being made with clean ingredients. Blueland doesn't use any single-use plastics from bottles, tablets, wrappers, to shipping materials, plus their products are EPA certified, vegan, and cruelty-free, and are made with clean ingredients without ammonia, chlorine, bleach, and parabens, all that nasty junk. Unlike the typical liquid cleaners that are sold in single-use plastics, with Blueland all you need to clean your house or your hands is this little tablet. I got the lavender eucalyptus and perrine lemon tablets, and I also got an iris agave one, which is what I used here. And all of them smell really good. Every time you buy a single-use plastic bottle, you're throwing your money away. It usually costs like $5 or $6 for one bottle of soap or cleaner. But with Blueland, it's just $2 a tablet or $1.55 if you buy in bulk. Of course, we need to be pressuring big corporations to stop destroying our environment and not produce so much single-use plastic in the first place, but individual choices can still help in their own way, and with reusable products like this, it's that much easier. Click my link below to get 15% off your first kit. You don't want to miss this because they seriously never do this, so definitely check it out. Thank you so much to Blueland for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about the Great Fairy Photography Hoax. In 1904, Harry Spite wrote in his book Chronicles and Stories of Bingley and District, around Bingley there used to be, and possibly there still is, a strong belief in the existence of fairies. In Gilstead Crags, there was an opening in the rocks known as Fairies' Hole, and it was said that the tiny creatures used to trip and dance and play in their merry antics in the bright moonlight. Anyone who intruded at such a time, it was said, would lose their sight. At Hardin, in a secluded part of Deep Cliff, it is said that the fairies could sometimes be heard clinging musical tongs, and what looked like tiny white garments hung out on the trees could be seen on bright nights. Fairies, the fae, or the little folk, are a deeply integral part of folk culture in the UK and Ireland. For hundreds of years, people were deeply spiritual in a very pagan way that Christianity could never quite stamp out, and so instead would supplant onto its own lore. This continued into the wholly unsurprising rise of the spiritualism movement, which cropped up largely during the late Victorian era and continued to influence society until long after the Second World War. Spiritualism originally began in the 1840s in upstate New York, where the at the time fringe religious movements like Mormonism and Millerism as well as the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, an early medium in the modern sense of the word, and Franz Mesmer, the father of mesmerism, which evolved into hypnotism, were taking hold and spreading new theories as to the nature of life after death. People believed that it was possible to communicate directly with God and angels, even if you aren't a chosen prophet. On March 31st, 1848, the Fox sisters of Hydesville, New York, claimed to have made direct contact with a spirit in their home through a system of tapping sounds, an event which would set off the spiritualism movement for the next century. I talked about the Fox sisters in my video on ghost hunting if you want to learn more about that. Spiritualism as a movement was extremely desirable to people for a number of reasons. These were times where death was literally everywhere, a time before vaccines and adequate medical care, with numerous compounding epidemics and wars. Everyone was regularly losing loved ones, and people were desperate for a way to speak to them or see them again. And people were usually deeply religious, so the mentality was already there for the spiritualist framework to work within. People were already receptive to certain supernatural ideas and believed in an afterlife, and even in angels. So surely now, in this era of scientific advancement that was the Industrial Revolution, it's not absurd to think that people could discover a way to scientifically communicate with the dead, right? People wanted it to be true so badly, and as we'll see, the urge for people to adamantly accept ideas that reinforce core beliefs that they already have will become a main feature of today's story. In my ghost hunting video, I talked about the Civil War's role in the rise of spiritualism, but today's relevant war is actually World War I, ironically dubbed the War to End All Wars. World War I saw a major shift in the way that war was done. New technologies and machines led to an incredibly large fatality count, as well as greater destruction of the land itself than ever before. Across Europe, the land was scarred by trenches and bomb craters and the tracks of the newly invented tanks. The people were scarred too. New kinds of bombs and guns left people horribly injured, blinded, amputated, and disfigured. The way that these soldiers who had drastic facial injuries were treated upon returning home was horrific. Often people were told not to look at these men at all, in a sort of backwards attempt at sympathy. Christopher Klein writes, "The blue benches outside of London's Queen's Hospital were reserved for men with shattered faces and smashed dreams. The colorful paint job warned the locals that they might want to avert their eyes, shielding them from coming face to face with the awful reality of the war, and saving the terribly disfigured young men from another look of horror, another uncomfortable stare." These wounded veterans often referred to themselves as the broken gargoyles, and many would undergo some of the first plastic surgery operations to reconstruct their faces as best as could be done, like those done by Dr. Harold Gillies. It was a war that heavily disheartened people and destroyed innumerable lives, and left people feeling like strangers to themselves and loved ones. And many others weren't left at all. As people clamored to cope with the sudden brutal losses of their loved ones, spiritualism was already there to fill that void and provide people with what felt like answers. By the 1910s, everyone had already grown up doing seances or watching their parents do them, whether seriously or for fun. It's no wonder that seances and other spiritualist and theosophical beliefs were what they turned to as the answer to their pain when the Great War left them in its wake. For many, a return to childhood fantastical ideas was an immediate coping mechanism, much the same way that many of us today may rewatch our favorite childhood TV shows when we're going through a hard time. People then often were drawn to supernatural tales they may have believed in as a child, like fairies. By this point, the idea of fairies had mostly been reformed. Rather than evil spirits who can and will harm you, fairies were recharacterized by children's media as sweet but mischievous and playful creatures who live in forests and gardens, do tiny work, and love nothing more than to dance and play harmless pranks. Theosophy and spiritualism sought to explain their possible existence by applying paranormal science to them. Fairies, they theorized, are made of energetic ectoplasm, the same as ghosts or angels, and they can take on whatever form that the greater human collective envisions them to be. Since this pseudoscientific theory linked ghosts to fairies, then, of course, any evidence of either would surely support the existence of the other. But, of course, most fairies are spotted reportedly by children. And in an era where photography was still an adult venture, it's not like all kids had an iPhone camera ready at hand to snap a picture of their fairy friends Thimbles and Mr. Butterbutt who live in the local tree stump. No. That was unheard of, until 1917, when two young girls in the small English village of Cottingley borrowed a camera to prove to their parents once and for all that they are not lying about seeing fairies. Elsie Wright, born in 1901, left school at 13 years old to begin working at a photography studio in Bradford. She was always artistic and had spent some time at Bradford College of Art, and thus found the work spotting black and white prints at the photo studio to be stunting her growth. After she left the job and before finding a new one, also working with photography, the Wright family took in Elsie's cousin Frances Griffiths and her mother Annie as they returned to England from living in South Africa. Frances's father was a soldier and was stationed in Africa during World War I. The year was 1917, and Frances and Elsie began their summer adventures. They loved to play around the Cottingley Beck near the Wrights' house, where Frances would often get in trouble for constantly falling in the water and getting her dress wet. But Frances especially was eager to visit the Beck because, although she struggled to make friends at school, she had apparently found some special friends of her own there. Frances recalled over 60 years later, "Elsie was working at that time because I was up the Beck quite a lot after school. It was good to sit quietly on the willow branch and listen to the sound of the water, the odd bee buzzing, and an occasional splash as a frog plunged into the deep pool. I suppose I must have been daydreaming one day when I looked across the Beck and saw a willow leaf twirling around rapidly, moving as it were on its own. The leaf was being held by a little man. The first time I saw the little man, he was about 18 inches high. He was walking purposefully down the bank on the willow side of the Beck, holding a willow leaf in his hand, twiddling it very fast as he crossed the water to the other side. I wasn't unduly surprised. The Beck was a wonderful place, and I wouldn't have been surprised at anything that happened there. As he reached the first branch of the willow, he lifted his hand, and although I saw him do it many times afterwards, a leaf just came into his hand. He held the leaf in his hand and twirled it round just as before, walking down to the Beck and crossing it. Now to me this did seem odd. He had a rugged face, similar I would think to the faces of the railway carters, who delivered goods on wagons driven by those lovely old Shire horses. He wasn't ugly, but neither did he have a friendly face. He just looked as if he was going about a job of work. I didn't tell Elsie for a long time. This was my secret, mine alone, and I didn't want to share it. Eventually, after another scolding by the adults asking her why she wants to be at the Beck so often, Frances burst into tears and cried, "I go to see the fairies, that's why. To see the fairies." To which Elsie also confirmed that she had seen fairies there. But the adults only laughed it off, and Elsie came up with an idea for how the girls could prove that they aren't lying. In early July, Elsie borrowed her father Arthur Wright's new quarter-plate Midge camera, although some people contest that it was a Midge, but whatever, and the girls went out to the Beck to take some photos. Less than an hour later, they ran back home and eagerly asked Arthur to develop the plate. When blurry shapes that appeared to be fairies showed up, the girls were triumphant, insisting to him that in the picture were the fairies that they were talking about. But Arthur was completely skeptical. 2 months later, the girls took a second photo, but their parents were still convinced that they were lying. While Frances and Elsie were at school, the adults searched the Beck and Glen as well as the girls' bedroom for anything that could give away how they did it. Paper cuttings, art scraps, anything, but they found nothing. Even more concerning to them was the fact that neither of the girls was ever a lying type, and the way that they spoke about the fairies was extremely casual, as evidenced by a letter that Frances wrote to her friend back in South Africa, where she offhandedly mentioned, "All think the war will be over in a few days. We are going to get our flags to hang up in our bedroom. I am sending you 2 photos, both of me. One is me in a bathing costume in our backyard. Uncle Arthur took that. While the other is me with some fairies up at the Beck. Elsie took that one. Rosebud is as fat as ever, and I have made her some new clothes. How are Teddy and Dolly? Elsie and I are friendly with the Beck fairies. Funny I never used to see them in Africa. It must be too hot for them there." This is where the story may have ended, if not for Annie Griffiths and Elsie's mother, Polly Wright. This is where our friends the Theosophical Society and Edward Gardner come into the picture. In the summer of 1919, the Bradford Theosophical Society held a meeting about fairies, which Annie and Polly attended because they had become increasingly interested in theosophy since the photos were taken. After the meeting, Polly mentioned Frances and Elsie's photos and was overheard by a friend of Edward Gardner, a major player in the Theosophical movement. Gardner, obviously, was eager to see the photos for himself. The photos were forwarded to him, and at first he too was skeptical. He had seen many fakes before, after all. So he asked the Wrights for the original negatives and had them sent to Harold Snelling, an expert in fake photography. Gardner recalled, "He took the negatives, smiled a little as he glanced at them, and started to ask a question, but stopped. 'Wait a moment,' he said, and went over to a glass-top desk, switched on a light underneath, placed the first negative on top, and began examining it with sundry lenses. He spent so long over it that I broke in with the question as to what interested him. The reply was something of a shock. Several things. This plate is a single exposure. These dancing figures are not made of paper nor of any fabric. They are not painted on a photograph background. But what gets me the most is that these figures have moved during exposure." Snelling, who didn't care about fairies, was positive that they weren't fakes. Edward Gardner was completely shocked. It seemed that for the very first time in history, photographic evidence of fairies had been captured. He commissioned Snelling for better quality prints and slides of the photos, and Snelling cleaned up the photo and faded out Frances's face just slightly so as to spotlight the fairies. This version of the photo is the one that we know best today. Gardner went on to exhibit the slides at his lectures, exposing them to wider audiences, which inevitably caught the eye of one of the most prominent spiritualists in history, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes and author of such classics as The Hound of the Baskervilles, very much believed in fairies. He also believed in ghosts and angels and any manner of occult phenomena, encouraged by his illustrator uncle and his father, who both had a fascination with fairies. His beliefs in the supernatural were reinforced when he joined the Society for Psychical Research in 1893, a group that we discussed briefly in my video on ghost hunting. Conan Doyle's son Kingsley tragically died of pneumonia in 1918 after being wounded in the Battle of the Somme in 1916, and he lost many other close people to him in the war as well, just like everybody else. This only strengthened his beliefs to the point where in the 20s he would lead a mass resignation of 84 members of the Society for Psychical Research because it was too skeptical, which is hilarious because the society was constantly being criticized for not being skeptical enough. In his later book, The Coming of the Fairies, published in 1922, he wrote, "Victorian science would have left the world hard and clean and bare, like a landscape on the moon. But this science is in truth but a little light in the darkness, and outside that limited circle of definite knowledge we see the loom and shadow of gigantic and fantastic possibilities around us, throwing themselves continually across our consciousness in such ways that it is difficult to ignore them." His beliefs in spiritualism were completely unshakable, a fact that shocked and confused many people who thought surely the creator of Sherlock Holmes must be a man of science and critical thinking. Alas, no. He was a longtime good friend of Harry Houdini, who had limited patience for Conan Doyle's beliefs, and tried many times to convince him that not everything you see is what it actually is. He once invited Sir Arthur over and performed a classic trick where he had him write a note outside the room, where Houdini couldn't see it, and then, when he walked back inside, Houdini rolled a cork ball drenched in ink around a piece of paper, and the note that Conan Doyle wrote out was spelled out on the paper. Ooh! Houdini insisted to him that what he did was trickery, not magic or clairvoyance, or anything like that. He wrote, "Now I beg of you, Sir Arthur, do not jump to the conclusion that certain things you see are necessarily supernatural, or the work of spirits, just because you cannot explain them. Do, therefore, be careful in the future in endorsing phenomena just because you cannot explain them." Let's just say that fell on deaf ears. Conan Doyle was like, "Oh, well played, Deanie boy. Now get a load of this. Watch as my wife, who is a medium by the way, communicates with your dead mother." So Lady Doyle wrote out probably the most generic ghost message anyone could possibly think of. "Oh, my darling, thank God at last I am through. I've tried oh so often. Now I am happy. Of course I want to talk to my boy, my own beloved boy. My only shadow has been that my beloved one has not known how often I have been with him all the while. I want him only to know that I have bridged the gulf. That is what I wanted. Oh, so much. Now I can rest in peace." Houdini was extremely not impressed. Houdini wrote back to Conan Doyle, "I was heartily in accord and sympathy at the seance, but the letter was written entirely in English, and my sainted mother could not read, write, or speak the English language." Houdini would go on to avidly reveal the cheating methods of psychics and mediums, which drew bad blood between him and Conan Doyle, and the friendship went to the grave. In 1926, in his book The Edge of the Unknown, Conan Doyle would insist that in fact Houdini really had spiritual powers, but was lying about them being fake. So, as you can imagine, when he heard that 2 little girls in Cottingley had captured photo evidence of the existence of fairies, he was not going to let that go. Conan Doyle managed to get copies of the Cottingley fairy photos, which was incredibly convenient for him as he had been commissioned by the Strand magazine to write an article on fairies for their Christmas 1920 issue. So, he and Edward Gardner teamed up to meet the Wrights and the Griffiths. By this point, Frances and Elsie were 13 and 19 years old respectively, and Gardner for some reason was worried that one of them might get married before they could meet. They rushed to have the photos examined by Kodak, who were shown Snelling's altered version rather than the negatives. They concluded that Snelling was correct, they are not fakes, but they cannot take it as conclusive evidence that they are photos of fairies. The Kodak technicians said, after all, fairies aren't real, so they had to be fakes, right? And so, they were not certified. Fuck, man. There's a bug in here. Conan Doyle and Gardner were livid. They decided to focus only on the photos having not been marked fakes and set off to meet the girls themselves. In July 1920, Edward Gardner traveled to Cottingley. Frances had already left to live with her father up in North Yorkshire, and so she wasn't there. Gardner spoke with Elsie and visited the Glen with her, where she answered his questions simply and nonchalantly. After much persuading, the family agreed to let the photos be published in the Strand so long as their names are changed. Gardner was thoroughly convinced of his own interpretation that Elsie and Frances were clairvoyant or psychic or mediums or something like that. When he visited Frances, she later recalled, "He was an uninteresting person who had nothing much to say. It was very difficult with him. They left me alone with him for about 10 minutes and then came and rescued me. He was just scrambling a few notes together. He wasn't scientific at all." Gardner himself was convinced by this point, but knew that the public wouldn't be. So he gifted Elsie and Frances with 2 cameo cameras and 12 photo plates each. In September 1920, Gardner received back 3 new negatives from the girls. This one, and the final photo they ever took in the series, the fairies' bower. Gardner and Conan Doyle promptly lost their minds when the photos were confirmed authentic by Snelling. Not authentic as in the fairies are real, but authentic as in the photos are real and haven't been tampered with in the process. The Strand published Conan Doyle's article calling the Wright family the Carpenters and Frances Alice. I cannot stress enough just how popular this issue was. It sold out in only a few days to a pretty mixed reaction by the public. Many people were amazed and excited that proof of fairies had been captured. Others were still skeptical, like the author Maurice Hewlett, who wrote, "Knowing children and knowing that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has legs, I decide that the Miss Carpenters have pulled one of them." As the story blew up, interest in the fairies aspect careened over into interest in the girls themselves. The Westminster Gazette sent out a reporter to Cottingley to investigate and uncover any dirt on them that he could find. He discovered their real identities and interviewed the family, though he still couldn't find any evidence of a hoax. In 1922, Arthur Conan Doyle piggybacked off of the Cottingley fairy craze and published The Coming of the Fairies, which took off quickly despite the waning interest in the story, and despite the fact that it was essentially just a collection of old reprints and Gardner's notes. Conan Doyle would become increasingly obsessed with his fairy investigations over the years and continued to publish about it. But even still, interest in the Cottingley Fairies fizzled out, and time continued its march onwards. Elsie and Frances got married, moved away, started new lives. They lived quietly and out of the public eye until 1965, when Elsie was contacted by a Daily Express reporter and interviewed. Elsie managed to dodge the reporter's skepticism, as she had with others many times before, and all went quiet again until 1970, when Edward Gardner died at 100 years old. As a result, the BBC became interested in the Cottingley Fairies, and the program nationwide interviewed both Elsie and Frances. Once again, they dodged all questions, and still the world wondered, are there really fairies in those photographs? Times had changed since the 20s, though. It was now the late 70s, and we had technology on our side to look at those photos with new, mechanical eyes. A magician and professional paranormal photo debunker named James the Amazing Randi got fixated on the Cottingley photos and brought on his team from the Center for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal to digitally enhance the photos. Randi stated that the fairies were cardboard cutouts copied from Princess Mary's gift book, published in 1914. Interesting. Around the same time, a professor named Joe Cooper had also become obsessed with the story, though more sympathetically at first. He particularly became obsessed with Frances, constantly visiting her and taking her on day trips. And in 1981, in Canterbury Cathedral, Frances at long last told someone the truth. She told Joe Cooper that she and Elsie had staged the photos, and Cooper's world fell apart along with those of everyone else who had staked their beliefs on these photos taken by two little girls who never asked for any of this at all. In Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers, the two now old women explained how they did it.
We, with the long hat pin, we put it down the back like that and stuck the tape at the back like that, and then gradually wormed that down. They were longer than that, though. They were about that then. 18 inches at least, and then worm that down into the earth. They said that the thing was that they could see that the fairies were moving when the photograph was taken, but that's because they did it in the breeze.
Cooper published his story and Elsie and Frances' confessions, writing, "It started, as both ladies agree, with the best of intentions. The attitude of Elsie and Frances to the whole question of the fairy photographs is a typical Yorkshire one, to tell a tall story with a deadpan delivery, and let those who will believe it do so." And that's exactly my point. As they put it themselves,
I'd never even thought of it being a fraud. It was just Elsie and I having a bit of fun. And I can't understand it to this day why people were taken in. They wanted to be taken in. Because people often say to me, don't you feel ashamed that you've made all these poor people look fools? They believed in you. But I don't, because they wanted to believe. We didn't have to tell a lie about it at all, because always somebody came out to justify it.
People latched on and believed the Cottingley Fairies story because they wanted to believe it. A bunch of grown adults looking for proof of fairies saw opportunity in the imaginations of two little girls, and things got out of hand. Elsie and Frances, I think, aren't in any way to blame for this. First of all, the hoax as a whole has never hurt anyone, despite what Joe Cooper's ex-wife seems to believe after he divorced her and fell off the face of the earth following the confessions. Anyone who got bamboozled or spent years of their lives researching it because they believed it did so because they already believed in fairies, and the Cottingley story was a tool for them to use. There were many people who believed in fairies but still didn't believe in the photos. Elsie and Frances were dragged along for the ride by two famous and powerful men. They were scared of the fact that they had managed to fool one of the most famous authors in the world, a man who, at the time, was thought of as incredibly smart and logical due to his association with Sherlock Holmes.
It was very embarrassing because, two village kids and a brilliant man like Conan Doyle, but we could only just keep quiet.
What could two little girls, especially back then, do in that situation other than go along with it? Elsie said, "Sir Arthur had lost his son recently in the war, and I think the poor man was trying to comfort himself in these things, so I said to Frances, we are a lot younger than Conan Doyle. So we will wait until they die of old age, and then we will tell. If they were to come out with the truth at the time, it would have potentially destroyed people's careers. Plus, the photos reinforced the already established beliefs of adults, further validating those beliefs. All humans do this with nearly every core belief that we have. If people believe something, they naturally seek out and trust information that confirms those beliefs. If your life's work is to prove the existence of fairies, and what appears to be proof of fairies falls into your hands, what else can you do but run with it? Years later, Elsie would admit she never believed in fairies in general, but Frances, on the other hand, who was always more involved in the situation anyways, always maintained that she really did see fairies in Cottingley Beck. The photos themselves were a practical joke to get back at their parents for scolding them so harshly for playing in the glen. Even though the parents didn't believe in the photos either when they saw them, if Elsie and Frances had owned up to staging them at that moment, they would have only been chastised again. So they bit their tongues and kept quiet, until one day, when the world came calling. What else could they do? They wrote it out until they were able to live quietly, and then the world came calling again. For the record, until the day she died, Frances swore that the fifth and final photo was genuinely real. Even her daughter thoroughly believed so. And the revelation that the photos were staged still didn't shake a lot of people's beliefs in fairies either, much in the same way that debunking any given ghost photo will never get people to stop believing in ghosts. Fred Gettings writes in The Unexplained, the story of the Cottingley Fairies was only partly created by Elsie and Frances. It was much more the creation of the media. Even after the confession killed the fantasy of the photos themselves, it continued to live on in the media. It became the subject of two movies, 1995's Fairy Tale, A True Story, which is actually a good movie, although I don't know why Harry Houdini had to be a main character when he had so little to do with the fairy story, and 1997's Photographing Fairies. Still today, years later, people take inspiration from the Cottingley Fairies to take their own staged fairy photos. I know I did as a kid. There's something really special about that, and I think that we can thank the Cottingley Fairies, whether they really do live in that glen or not, for keeping the magic alive.
I'd swear that there are fairies up there. Well, there were then. There aren't now.
Thank you so much for exploring the story of the Cottingley Fairies with me. Were you into fairies as much as I was as a kid? Let me tell you, all fairy media had me in a grip. Winx Club and the Fairytopia series in particular. But I distinctly remember walking through Blockbuster in the mid-2000s as a kid and renting a copy of Fairy Tale, A True Story, and the photos have captivated me ever since. Anyway, until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and don't forget to leave a petals full of sugar water out for the fairies in your garden.